Coming up from recurring dry spells to powerful hurricane systems, Guatemala is in the path of increasingly extreme weather events. They wreck local agriculture and hurt the country's youngest. Refrigerants are part of our daily life, but they're incredibly harmful to the planet. Can we continue living with them? The technology in play to show us how. But first, environmentalists' hopes are dashed by a UK judge who throws out their case against the controversial oil and gas project in British seas.
All of this is completely counterintuitive.
This is Just 2 Degrees on TRT World. Environmentalists challenging the UK's North Sea oil and gas exploration plans have suffered a major setback. That's because the London High Court has ruled that it was indeed lawful for the government to authorise new energy licences. Climate campaigners at Greenpeace had argued that Britain's failure to assess the greenhouse gases produced by consuming oil and gas rendered the North Sea plan unlawful. The judge in the case said the decision to not assess end-use emissions was not irrational.
The International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, says that we must have no new fossil fuel digs or drills. So the key organization that is concerned with CO2, with climate, says this must not happen. What's more important in terms of the UK legal situation, the regulation, the strategic environmental impact, which is the report, the study that goes into, that sort of validates this, did not take into account CO2 emissions from this oil and gas field. And the judge, giving his ruling, said that there was not likely to be a significant effect from the emissions from this oil drill. So all of this is completely counterintuitive.
Yeah, the wording used was end-use emissions. What are they pertaining to exactly?
End-use emissions are when this oil and gas are burned. The judge said quite extraordinarily that there was not a sufficient link between the drilling and those emissions. In other words, the judge, quite in an extraordinary judgment, said that there was not sufficient link between the drilling of this oil and gas and their use.
I think you using the word extraordinary sums this up. How could this have happened when the evidence is there, the link between oil and gas drilling, exploration, and global warming? Was it a convincing argument by the lawyers who fought in favor of these projects? What do you think happened?
It looks profoundly problematic. And of course, Greenpeace have again appealed to this decision. So we're not seeing the end of this. Greenpeace will take this further. And also the minutiae of this judgment is also based on other forms of judgment that haven't reached resolution yet. So in strict legal terms, there's still all to play for. In terms of the judgment itself, it's just astonishing. We know that the IPCC say that by 2030, by 2035, if we have any chance of sticking to 1.5, in other words, controlling climate change, we must not drill new oil and new gas. So this ruling by the judge and this decision by the current UK government does seem extraordinary.
Earth's hydrologic cycle controls the way water moves on the planet between the land and the atmosphere. It provides all things or living things with H2O and moves nutrients in and out of aquatic ecosystems. Well, the World Meteorological Organization recently warned that the cycle is, quote-unquote, spinning out of balance due to the climate crisis. Its latest report on worldwide water resources found that over 50% of the land that catches and stores rainwater and feeds rivers worldwide is drier than usual.
About half of the world has experienced increase of flooding events, and about 1/3 of the planet has been facing increase of drought events. We know that 1 degree warming of the climate means that we have 7% more humidity in the atmosphere, which means that it's enhancing the flooding potential. We also know that the melting of glaciers is speeding up, and in the report we are showing that, for example, the Swiss mountain glaciers, especially the alpine ones, they have lost about 10% of their mass last year and this year, which is a record high amount of loss of that. And unfortunately, we have lost this glacier melting game already. The glacier melting and sea level rise may continue for the coming thousands of years because of already high concentration of carbon dioxide. In general, we will have challenges to get water for agriculture, for human beings, industry, and also for hydropower production. And we also know that the warming of rivers and waters in general is causing problems for power production. Both classical fossil fuel-based power plants need the cooling power, and also nuclear power plants need it.
Heavy downpours have triggered flooding in Ghana. The West African nation has experienced unpredictable weather throughout the year, which scientists warn is linked to global warming. Torrential rains ravaged the Volta region in the east of the country. Crops have been destroyed and schools were closed after 2 hydroelectric dams burst. More than 26,000 people, mostly women and children, have been displaced. Floods are no rare occurrence in Ghana. In June, 500 homes were flooded. At least 8 people were killed. And Central America's dry corridor is an area that's prone to extreme weather, from prolonged dry spells to hurricanes and tropical storms that grow stronger in intensity every year. Guatemala, for one, which is highly dependent on agriculture, suffered major crop losses in 2023. It's had detrimental effects on the most vulnerable. At this nutrition clinic in Alta Verapaz, Guatemala, a nurse checks a 2-year-old's weight and height. The scale comes in at just 7.6 kilograms, the average weight of a 6-month-old baby. Little Edgar also has cerebral palsy. He's unable to chew solid foods and can only take liquids. Severe cases of malnutrition among children under 5 in Guatemala are up by more than 33% compared to the same period a year ago. And at least 127 children were suspected to have died of hunger in the first 9 months of 2023. Locals blame irregular weather.
Porque tenemos periodos de lluvia muy marcados, en donde la precipitación que debería de caer en un término de 15 días, pues puede caer en 2 días. Y por lo mismo se deriva un periodo seco en donde los cultivos sufren estrés hídrico y hay pérdidas totales de los cultivos.
The dry corridor is a region in Central America that's highly vulnerable to extreme climate events. El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Guatemala have been seeing long periods of drought, as well as hurricanes that cause widespread crop damage. Maria Concepcion Rodriguez, a Guatemala living in the city of El Aguacate, recalls having just a few tortillas and a half bowl of beans to feed her 6 children one day in August. While global warming is a major culprit, Guatemala's health ministry says inflation, the COVID pandemic, and Russia's war in Ukraine also threaten food security for a country whose economy relies heavily on coffee, sugar, corn, and beans. Projections for the rest of 2023 do show slight improvement over a year ago, but they remain worse than previous measured years. The cooling industry accounts for around 10% of global carbon dioxide emissions. That's 3 times the amount produced by aviation and shipping combined. So it seems our desire to keep cool could be making the world hotter. Refrigerants are a chemical compound found in all cooling systems. Scientists have urged manufacturers to phase out their use because the gases they leak damage the environment. But as increasing global temperatures drive up demand, a shift to more sustainable cooling systems is already underway.
Did you know there is one thing we can eliminate that could keep global average temperatures from rising by almost half a degree? It's in our freezers, refrigerators, air conditioners, and cools our cars and shopping centers in every city around the world. It's refrigerant, a fluid used in air cooling systems that changes easily from liquid to gas, and it's highly destructive to the Earth's sensitive atmosphere, making the climate hotter and more unstable. Here's a look at the substance that poses a potent threat to our environment. They're called hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, gases that leak into the atmosphere when the equipment operates, especially when it's faulty. HFCs are up to 9,000 times more harmful to the environment than CO2 and have greater global heating potential. And if a broken or old system is not disposed of or recycled in a responsible way, those HFCs are all released into the atmosphere.
So instead of disposing those, we can actually clean those and repurpose those, which avoids a new molecule of refrigerant from ever having to be made.
But there's some momentum to phase out these pollutants within a global action plan. In 2016, officials from over 150 countries signed the Kigali Amendment, agreeing to reduce HFC consumption by 80% by 2047.
Now turning the curve on one of the most potent group of greenhouse gases, the ones that are contributing significantly to global warming, were expected to continue to escalate. We are going to be chopping that down to a very minimal level by the middle of this century. It's a historic agreement. It will achieve a great deal. It will keep our kids' future safe, and it's going to protect public health. And if you look at it, we are going to achieve somewhere in the order of 80 to 90% of the emission reductions from these chemicals. It is staggering what this will achieve. We're talking about an amount that's comparable to thousands of coal-fired power plant emissions.
If achieved, it could avoid irreparable environmental harm, as these chemicals remain in our atmosphere for up to 29 years. But demand for cooling systems is growing, and while the International Energy Agency reports the number of units in Europe could quadruple by 2050, they aren't as much of a threat when they're new. 90% of refrigerant emissions occur at a cooling system's end of life.
The question is what happens to it when you actually throw it away, right? And is somebody properly recovering the refrigerant without releasing anything to the environment?
So the way these systems are being disposed of is changing, and manufacturers have also taken note. Major global brands such as Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and Unilever have set goals to phase out HFCs entirely, and have already started to use more environmentally friendly alternatives, such as ammonia, certain hydrocarbons, and CO2. Researchers are also looking at developing even better coolant alternatives.
My laboratory is trying to develop a new generation of solid refrigerants that can provide more sustainable cooling. We're trying to replace the volatile fluorocarbon refrigerants like Freon that are present in nearly every air conditioner and refrigerator around the world.
And as cooling technology advances, it'll ease the burden on the climate. McCabe, just 2 degrees.
In the French Alps, the Mont Blanc mountain range is the site of the 4th largest glacier in the country, the Tête. Like many glaciers these days, it's retreating, and as it does, it's revealing a new wetland ecosystem. In fact, glaciologists say France has seen around 400 kilometers of wetlands which actively store carbon revealed due to glacial melting since 1850. But as the ecosystems shift, the time left to protect them is running out.
Le retrait glaciaire sur Terre est en train de faire apparaître plein de zones humides, notamment dans les régions arctiques, où il y a des... Ici, les glaciers, ils se retirent dans des zones très raides, mais quand ils sont dans l'Arctique, c'est des zones plus planes, et là, il y a des immenses zones humides qui sont en train de se former, qui sont les tourbières de demain. Donc il faut les préserver, parce qu'elles ont un rôle extraordinairement important. Il aurait mieux fallu qu'on ait un grand glacier ici, parce qu'ils sont tellement importants pour la biodiversité, pour l'eau, pour le climat sur Terre, mais à défaut, en fait, je pense que ça nous laisse une forme de deuxième chance. On a fait fondre les glaciers, on n'a pas réussi à les préserver. Et bien peut-être qu'on a une deuxième chance, c'est comment on peut protéger la nature qui émerge du retrait glaciaire. Et donc les mots qui seraient intéressants, c'est sanctuaire du vivant, Éden. En fait, ici, on est en train de voir se développer en temps réel des écosystèmes primaires. Ça veut dire non impactés par l'homme, sans le contrôle de l'homme qui va ici mettre des poissons, là-bas mettre telle espèce, choisir l'espèce d'arbre et tout. Là, c'est la nature qui décide et puis elle prend les meilleures décisions. Les arbres qui ne supporteront pas les conditions climatiques-là, ils ne vivront pas. Et les arbres qui se développeront, ils seront adaptés aux conditions, en tout cas, qui vont changer.
Insects, well, they're an essential part of Earth's ecosystems. As pollinators, they're vital to the survival of many plant species and play a major role in the production of fruits, vegetables, and flowers. But changes in climate are changing the way they reproduce, and the impact is already being felt in France.
Bugs are out of balance in central France, which has seen unusually high temperatures in the month of October.
Donc aujourd'hui, en fait, on voit une persistance d'un grand nombre de populations d'insectes sur le terrain qui sont favorisées par les conditions météo que l'on observe actuellement. Pour entrer en hibernation ou en diapause, comme on dit pour les insectes, il faut qu'il y ait à la fois une réduction des températures et une réduction de la durée du jour. Aujourd'hui, ces deux conditions ne sont pas réunies, donc on voit les populations persister plus longtemps.
Scientists say life cycles of many insect species, which usually follow seasonal changes, are out of whack due to higher temperature and unusual humidity levels. Those that usually hibernate after being active between May and September are sticking around well into November. Asian hornets, for example.
Très clairement, l'impact climatique a une persistance sur les colonies. En fait, en ce moment, vu qu'il fait plus chaud, le frelon asiatique, comme d'autres espèces, continue à se développer comme si c'était la saison normale. Et donc, ça fait plus d'individus et donc plus de populations sur le terrain.
Another example is the tiger mosquito, a carrier of viruses including dengue fever, West Nile, and Zika. Once poorly adapted to large cities, it's now invaded most of France.
Le fait du réchauffement climatique, finalement, son aire de répartition remonte progressivement vers le nord. Pendant quelques années, il était présent, mais n'arrivait pas à faire tout son cycle de développement. Aujourd'hui, les conditions sont suffisamment favorables pour qu'il puisse faire tout son cycle de développement sur notre territoire, en région Centre-Val de Loire, et donc s'installer concrètement sur le territoire.
But what works for some insects threatens the survival of others.
Il y a des espèces d'insectes qui ont besoin d'une hibernation. Il y a une diapause obligatoire. Et donc, s'il n'y a pas de conditions hivernales, il n'y a pas les conditions réunies pour qu'il y ait cette phase nécessaire d'hibernation pour ensuite faire une génération au printemps. Et donc là, pour ces insectes, ça pourrait être catastrophique.
Sarah Balter, just 2 degrees.
I spoke with Declan McCabe about this. He's a professor of biology at St. Michael's College in Dublin, Ireland. He's also got a new book coming out in 2024 called Turning Stones, Exploring the Life of Water. He's also got a podcast called Nature Snippets, in case you'd like to hear more from him. Hi, Declan. It's nice seeing you. Firstly, talk about the negatives of having longer insect life cycles.
Yeah, that can really impact the species that are affected by insect vectors, for example. So you could have a situation where you now have longer exposure to mosquitoes, for example, and in turn you've got longer exposure to the diseases spread by mosquitoes. And we know of examples already in the bird world where there's one bird that never previously even was affected by malaria and currently is infected because of changes in insect distributions for the most part.
Interesting. But I'm guessing there is a positive side here. For example, bees that are around for longer can pollinate more, can't they?
Yes, that's certainly the case. And many bees are out for a longer season. So we see it in my part of the world, we see where there's extensions in both the spring and the fall. So in autumn, we have insects that are here later into the season that previously would have succumbed to the cold sooner. So there is pollination advantages. There are some disadvantages in that the phenology and the timing of when plants flower and when the insects arrive, there can be a mismatch because the plants are still responding to day length while the insects are responding to temperature. So sometimes you can get a mismatch. So there are pluses and minuses. For many of our fruiting trees, there are advantages in that there are pollinators available sooner. And some of the trees, such as apples, are producing flowers sooner. And so that match is working pretty well. But Nothing's perfect. You know, we've tinkered with the system.
Let me backtrack a little bit, Declan. We're in autumn now, it's just begun. What is supposed to happen at this time of year? When are insects supposed to start hibernating? And what does that hibernation look like? You could just choose one insect, I guess, because I guess maybe they're different for different insects.
Absolutely. It's all over the map. And insects spend their winters in different ways. So some insects spend the winters as eggs in the soil. Some insects are actively hibernating. So there are butterflies, for example, that emerge in the autumn and find crevices in tree bark to hibernate. And so the hibernation timing changes just a little bit. So it'll happen a little bit later because we have warmer autumns. And then, you know, some insects overwinter as pupae, and they'll be in their chrysalis, for example, and it simply is a shift in the timing, and the pupation period can be shorter. So, you know, there's compression of winter and expansion of autumn and expansion of springtime. So I'm not sure it exactly answers your question, but there are many shifts that are happening.
So most insects should be fully in hibernation by the time winter begins.
Yeah, that's typically the case because their flight muscles are incapable of contraction when the weather is cold, so they can't fly. So most of our terrestrial, you know, insects are in that category. They're either hibernating or they exist as eggs over winter. But the aquatic insects, which that's my specialty, the aquatic insects are actually very, very active underwater or under ice through the winter. So the aquatic insects do most of their feeding while the terrestrial insects are hibernating. So it's a little bit of a paradox. The aquatic insects do, you know, they eat all of the leaves that have fallen in autumn. That's their food source. So they're under the ice and they're doing just fine. It's interesting.
Just before this interview, we had a report that talked a bit about hornets, which is a scary species for some people. Do you think there's a knock-on effect of having hornets around for much longer, multiplying, and possibly a threat to people?
In the autumn, hornets and wasp species in general become more aggressive. Typically what's happened, because they are finished with their life cycle and they typically die off. And their last gasp, so to speak, is to look around for some sugar to sustain themselves. The queen hibernates in most species of that nature, and the workers do not. The workers die off. So it's possible that we've extended the die-off period a little bit because we've warmed the climate enough that there's 2 weeks of additional activity at the end of the season. And so it is possible that that interaction could be extended into a later time period. And, you know, they'll disrupt your picnic. So they can be aggressive at this time of year.
Before I let you go, are there any detrimental effects to insects themselves because they are awake for longer?
So I think disease transmission is one issue. I think the hornets are certainly an issue. There are also species that are impacting spruce trees, for example, and because they have not had the killing temperatures that would kill the insects in the winter, they haven't had as deep a frost in winter, then they may spread their activities to previously uninfested areas. So black spruce in North America, for example, is affected by spruce budworm, and the warmer temperatures, warmer minimum can increase their outbreak frequencies. At the other side of it, the warmer maximum temperatures can reduce their activities. So it really depends on the weather and how the weather interacts with the long-term climate trend. But there definitely are outbreak species that can defoliate trees that will respond to the changing climate and can have outbreaks in areas that were not previously affected. So that's a problem.
All right, Declan, really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Sweden is working on plans to ban gasoline and diesel cars from 2025 and create an environmental zone in the capital, Stockholm. And it's all to reduce pollution, decrease noise, and promote the use of electric vehicles. The new measure would cover a 20-block section of the city, which already has its fair share of parks, bike lanes, and spacious sidewalks. It sounds like a great idea, But not everyone's convinced.
I'm really in favor of Stockholm and other capitals taking the lead role in transitioning to more green cities. Meanwhile, these specific policies do not lead to any positive effects. It only harms local businesses, takes police resources to enforce the ban, and also makes it more difficult for people living in the city and outside of the city that does not have can afford a changing vehicle.
And that's our show. But before we leave you, here are North Macedonia's Vignes vineyards. Workers look pretty busy here, but output has actually decreased this year by as much as 30%. That's essentially because grapes are highly sensitive to rising temperatures. At the same time, though, winemakers say those same conditions increase the fruit's sugar content, reduce acidity, accelerate ripening, and lead to changes in wine characteristics. Output has dropped, but the quality of the final product this year has been remarkably high.